Hi, everyone. My name is Caleb Simon. I am a clinical marriage and family therapist here at Resolve Counseling and Wellness. Today, I'm here to talk about a brief overview of the DSM-5 TR. Now, just as a quick little introduction and so that you know where we're headed, I'm going to give a little bit of a history of DSM. Hopefully, it's not too dry. I kind of think it's really interesting, actually, how we got from where it started to where we are today. Then we're going to talk about differences between DSM-4 and DSM-5, and then DSM-5 and DSM-5 TR. And then toward the end of our presentation, I'm going to introduce some spectrums of how we might view diagnoses a little bit differently than we have historically, based on some literature that I've read. So let's get to it. So our objectives for today are to explore a brief history of the DSM, discuss changes between DSM-4 and DSM-5, and then introduce changes made in DSM-5 TR, explore the 8 primary spectrums, and cover the specialty areas. I'm looking forward to all of this. Don't make fun of my little 20XX down in the bottom corner. I know it's 2023. PowerPoint would not let me change that no matter how hard I tried. So the history of the DSM, the initial reason for developing a classification of mental health disorders was actually statistical, which I thought was kind of interesting. We just developed a book and put some possible diagnoses in it so that we could better measure what was going on in society. In 1921, what is now the APA collaborated with New York Academy of Medicine to develop a nationally acceptable psychiatric classification that was used for basically for diagnosing inpatient patients with severe psychiatric and neurological disorders. But that's really the roots of the DSM before it happened, 1921. So, geez, 31 years before the first DSM was even released. And so DSM-1 released in 1952 and contained 106 mental disorders. Anywhere that you see quotes in this presentation today, I'm using language of that time. So contained 106 mental disorders. The terminology and diagnoses were largely based on World War II psychiatric terminology, which I thought was really interesting. And the ICD, so the International Classification of Diseases, was already up to its 6th edition at this time. So the field of psychiatry and psychology were really behind the 8 ball by 1952. DSM-2, released in 1968, had 182 diagnoses, and it strived for an atheoretical approach, meaning basically they wanted anyone to be able to use it regardless of the approach that they took in their work with the clients that they were seeing. However, psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory were still pretty influential over DSM-2. So you can imagine where some of the pitfalls might have been. And it was designed at this point to conform to ICD-8. And I'm just putting that in there to do a little bit of a comparison between the International Classification of Diseases and the DSM. I think it's interesting that, in 1952, they're at ICD-6. By the time that we get to DSM-2 in 1968, there's already been ICD-7 and ICD-8. So there's it's not quite like a race, but the DSM is looking to stay updated as the ICD continues to update its editions as well. DSM-3. So DSM-3 was released in 1980, 265 diagnoses, but this is where the DSM really starts to kind of look like what we know it to be today because of the multi-axial system. The multi-axial system rose because we wanted to go to a biopsychosocial model as a field, and that wasn't really possible with the previous 2 DSMs. However, one of the noted shortcomings of the DSM-3 is that it was an all or nothing approach to diagnoses. If the specific number of symptoms was not met, there just was no applicable diagnosis. Even if, let's say, there were 6 criteria that needed to be met, if you met 5, you did not meet the diagnosis. So that all or nothing approach was something that, as we all know, was sought to be rectified in later versions. Uh, the DSM-3R, the R meaning revised in this case. So the DSM-3 revised expanded us to 292 diagnoses and slight changes in the diagnostic criteria. I think it's important here to note this multi-axial system because we all, for the most part, have heard that maybe in school or other CEU presentations, and the roots of this system and what it meant and how revolutionary this was for the DSM-3 at this time and how revolutionary it was for the field of mental health and psychology, psychiatry. Axis 1 was clinical disorders of mental illness. Axis 2 was personality disorders and mental retardation. Axis 3 was general medical conditions. Axis 4, psychosocial and environmental problems. And Axis 5, global assessment of functioning. So between those axes, we get a more well-rounded look at what it is to be a human being, quite frankly, and also what does it mean to make a diagnosis based off of all of these different axes and how they impact this person's day-to-day life. It's a step toward the spectrum system that we know today. So DSM-4 released in 1994, 297 diagnoses. The initial change from DSM-3 was not really all that much. As you see on this slide, DSM-3 revised is at 292 diagnoses. There's only 5 more that get added in DSM-4, and there were 14 years between those. So the change really wasn't much initially. The focus of DSM-4 was on the literature and the data review, basically increasing the evidence base, giving the field a little bit more of a leg to stand on, if you will. DSM-3 was the center of some controversy due to lack of evidence base in some of the areas, some of the diagnoses. And so that was why DSM-4 sought to rectify this. The 13 different work groups, they focused on that literature and data review. The first major change in intention with the DSM, because DSM 1, 2, and 3 were more about, accurate diagnoses to the level of the literature, the data that they had at those times. DSM-4 was, okay, how do we really, really, really focus on our evidence base? How do we back this up with research? And DSM-4 TR, and that was released in 2000. That's important, so hold on to that. But the TR stands for text revision. Attempted to correct any errors and improve the support material. So basically just from the time, between 1994 and 2005, more or less, that became like an update on some of that lit review and data review. And that was the main focus of DSM-4 and DSM-4 TR, was increase that evidence base. Let's make our field a little bit more thorough in terms of how we view these things, and again, give ourselves that leg to stand on. DSM-4 was designed to conform to ICD-9 originally, and made slight refinements to better conform with it in the text revision. And so you can see there really is this integrated relationship between the DSM and the ICD. And I just think that that's really interesting in terms of the way that the medical field and that classification of diseases has shaped how we view mental health disorders. So DSM-5, this is where the fun really begins. DSM-5 was released in 2013. This fact, to me, when I was reading it and looking up the timelines, granted, I am a bit of a research nerd, but when I was looking up the timelines, I was like, wait a minute. Revision of DSM-4 began in 1999, but DSM-4 TR came out in 2000. meaning DSM-5 was in the process of being created when DSM-4 text revision was released. I thought that was interesting that the work groups were revising DSM-4 for the text revision while also working on the next numbered version of the DSM. That stood out to me as kind of interesting. Uh, so that revision of DSM-4 overall to create DSM-5 began in 1999, as I said, and there were 13 working groups assigned. Uh, this it it DSM-5 contains both ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes and wanted to conform to ultimately to ICD-10, but ICD-10 got delayed by quite a bit, almost like over 10 years, if I'm recalling. And so DSM-5 contains both ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes because of that delay. But DSM-5 originally was created to conform to ICD-10. Beginning of the new era, mental health and diagnoses exist along a spectrum. That spectrum-based mindset allows ourselves as clinicians to focus on the acuteness of symptoms, gather more information, and have more insight when we're creating a treatment plan. It also results in more accurate diagnosing because this eliminates that all or nothing approach, as I brought up, was being problematic in DSM-4 or DSM-3 and carried over to DSM-4. I've got an example from the APA here about how they word the continuum spectrum based assessment, just because I think it's interesting to conceptualize and hear directly from the APA. And so they say, the example of continuum-based assessment is evident in the new diagnosis of substance use disorder. DSM-5 combines two separate diagnoses of abuse and dependence into a single spectrum of 11 symptoms. In DSM-4, the distinction between abuse and dependence was based on the concept of abuse as a mild or early phase and dependence as a more severe manifestation. In practice, it was an arbitrary dichotomy, as those of us who do addiction work realize, like that doesn't feel like two different things. And the abuse criteria could sometimes be severe, but how do you know if it's crossed over to that dependence back then? The revised substance use disorder in DSM-5 and moving forward better matches those symptoms that our clients experience, in their words, that patients experience. It allows us to view these things on that mild, moderate, severe, based on the types of symptoms and the number of symptoms they're experiencing, rather than some arbitrary, is it abuse, is it dependence? Cool. Changes in the DSM-5 TR. So, reevaluation in social issues, literature reviews, language updates, diagnostic criteria was modified, symptom coding for suicidal behavior and non-suicidal self-injury was added, and 2 diagnoses were added. So to me, the 1, 3, and 4 out of those are the most substantial. That diagnostic criteria, most of it is very, 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 very minor. I'll give you a couple examples of that. But at the end of this presentation, I also am providing a link to the APA that gives you every single minute change that was made from DSM-5 to DSM-5 TR. Let's continue. So, changes in that DSM-5 text revision. Language updates. This is so cool to me, and so well, just affirming, accepting that this language feels really good to me. Experienced gender replaces desired gender. Gender affirming medical procedure replaces cross-sex medical procedure. Individual assigned male/female at birth replaces natal male/female. Intellectual development disorder replaces intellectual disability. Functional neurological symptom disorder replaces conversion disorder. And antipsychotic medication replaces neuroleptic. So some of those are to be more inclusive. Some of those are to be more accepting and just kind to the clients that we serve. And some of them are to be a little bit more medically accurate, as evidenced by the antipsychotic medication replacing neuroleptic. Uh, in the middle column here, diagnostic criteria modified. It was revised for 70, over 70 disorders, and that includes major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, manic episodes, bipolar 1 and 2, cyclothymic disorder, PTSD in children was modified, autism spectrum disorder, and avoidant restrictive food intake disorder are some of the examples. But again, most of these changes were very minor. And how minor they are, I think this part's interesting too. That change in criterion A in autism spectrum verbiage is changed to as manifested by all of the following. In previous versions, it was as manifested by any of the following. So some of those criteria for those 70 plus disorders literally changed one word. But for individuals who are trained in and are able to make those diagnoses for autism spectrum disorder, I would imagine that change in criteria allows them a little bit more flexibility when we're more accurately conceptualizing and more accurately placing this diagnosis based on this change in criteria. And then readopted DSM-4 specifiers for manic episodes due to conflict with criterion C. And this is just interesting to me again because these small changes make a really big difference. And I think that it's important that we understand these things. So I'm going to read this directly from the APA. The mild severity specifier for manic episodes was inconsistent with the manic episode criterion C, which requires that the mood disturbance be sufficiently severe enough to cause marked impairment in social occupational functioning, necessitate hospitalization, or include psychotic features. Well, you can see there's a conflict there because how would it be a mild manic episode if we were dealing with hospitalization and psychotic features? That feels a little bit more in the severe realm. So there were changes made. There were some changes made in those in that mild severity specifier to more accurately diagnose what our client's going through, rather than having to see if we can justify this being more severe or less severe. Having that change in the mild severity specifier helps us to avoid all of that. And then symptom coding added. This is really big. Symptom coding was added for non-suicidal self-injury, and it was added for suicidal behavior. So for non-suicidal self-injury, I thought that this was important to note as well. It can be based on current presentation or the client's experience over the past year. So that might be important to note in someone's file if they come in and say, I have a history of self-harm. I have not self-harmed in the last 6 months. I'm feeling good about that. It could still be important to have that noted in their file. And now we have a symptom code to help us bolster that, help us to remember that, help us to put a definitive symptom code on that. And then suicidal behavior. Suicidal behavior is an attempt within the past 2 years, so 24 months, and then you can specify if it's current or if it's in remission. The criteria for in remission is just, has this happened in the last year or not? So if it has not, but it happened in the last 2 years, then it could be in remission. If it's happened within the last year, we would specify that as current. It is also important to note that this code is not applicable for suicidal ideation or preparatory acts. This is for a carried out suicide attempt. And finally, these codes can be used with or without other DSM diagnoses, which I think is important because then we don't have to shoehorn some other diagnosis to go along with this. More than likely there would be another diagnosis anyway, but in time or in situations where we want to just note these things, we have a code for it now. It's important to note that those codes are found in the other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention section of the DSM-5 TR. And in the words of the APA, this includes conditions and psychosocial or environmental problems that are not considered to be mental disorders, but otherwise affect the diagnosis, course, prognosis, or treatment of an individual. So what they're saying is that these two codes are they are possibly affecting other diagnoses, and they're certainly affecting the treatment of that individual, but the symptom code is just noting the behavior. Changes specifically in the DSM-5 TR with diagnoses. So the only new diagnosis that was added is F43.8, prolonged grief disorder. And the thing that I thought was kind of interesting about this part is, what would this diagnosis have been prior to the change? I racked my brain a little bit about it. It other specified trauma disorder. I could see persistent depressive disorder possibly. Historically, that would have been dysthymia. Maybe major depressive disorder. I'm not sure where prolonged grief would have gone as a diagnosis before this got added. So I think this is really cool that it got added because of this next point. It normalizes the extended bereavement. As humans, there's no true grief cycle. We all handle grief differently. We may go back and forth between different stages of grief, and it impacts some people differently than others. And for me, like, although bereavement and depression can look similar, if we're saying that bereavement is considered normal, it shouldn't be diagnosed as depression. If bereavement is something that we go through normally, why would we categorize that as depression? So I think that was a lot of the basis in adding this disorder, is that bereavement is normal. And this is noting that for some people, bereavement may be extended beyond what is average, but it's still not depression. It's still not other specified trauma disorder or anything like that. So a summary of the criteria is just death of a loved one more than a year ago, and the client is experiencing near constant intense yearning for or preoccupation with the deceased, and this is causing significant distress. This is getting in the way of their life. This is stopping them from living, from in some way being functional. And then we have to hit three or more of loneliness, meaninglessness, emotional numbness, identity disruption, denial of loss, avoiding reminders, intense emotional pain, and being unable to resume activities that would have been normal for the client previously. I think this is a really cool diagnosis, just in terms of being able to normalize clients' experiences without labeling it as something inaccurate or putting a label on it that maybe holds stigma. Unspecified mood disorder. This one was, everything's interesting to me in this realm, but this was also interesting to me because unspecified mood disorder had been removed from the DSM in order to, in the words of the APA, emphasize bipolar and depressive disorder diagnoses. And my understanding of what they mean by that is they felt like unspecified mood disorder was inaccurate historically. So by emphasize, they mean that someone who is experiencing unspecified mood disorder should fit somewhere in the bipolar or depressive disorder realm. However, the field quickly found out that doesn't work that way. So this has been re-added. It's been re-added in both bipolar and depressive chapters because it's that way in the DSM as well. And for this diagnosis moving forward, it allows us to know, like, there's something going on with this client's mood, with their reactions, with how they handle a given situation, or even if they present mixed and we kind of don't have a read on them, it allows us to make a diagnosis and document effectively without putting on one of these other labels of bipolar disorder or one of the depressive disorders that may not be wholly accurate. So, introducing the 8 primary spectrums. So these primary spectrums are not included in the DSM. This came from uh, the literature, understanding. Let me grab it. The DSM-5 TR, Insanely Simplified. Now, this book's been recommended. It's eligible for CEU courses in other realms. I read this book and I thought it was phenomenal in terms of, well, number one, helping to understand some of these changes that I've introduced already today, but also helping myself to understand mental health in a little bit of a different way through these 8 primary spectrums. So Dr. Stephen Buser and Dr. Len Cruz are the authors of this book, and they're the ones who formulated these 8 primary spectrums. Again, these won't be found within the DSM. These are things to help us better understand the DSM and understand like where we might be missing missing information in our viewpoints, what maybe we need to look for in terms of uh, where is like an ideal spot on a spectrum for given diagnoses. Uh, let's get into it. So, the depression spectrum, shallowness versus despair. So, this spectrum is one about how much sorrow do you hold? We tend to think about depression, and on a spectrum, normally we would think of depression as mild, moderate, severe, right? And throughout these next 8 slides, Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz really challenge us to think about these not on a spectrum of severity, but more of a spectrum of functionality. And so where we're at with this, certain degrees of sadness and depression are part of everyday life. We've all experienced that at one point or another, or in reaction to certain things in our lives. If we're on the left end of this spectrum, that's the shallow end of this spectrum, because we have shallowness versus despair. If someone's shallow in this sense, they're indifferent. They may seem like immune to sad emotions. They may not really like engage on introspection. They may have a difficulty of like learning from their mistakes because of that shallow level of introspection and even possibly idea of self. I think you'll understand where I'm going with this once I describe the other side of this spectrum. So on the opposite end, the despair, the deep in the depression. So this is going to be endless brooding, endless introspection. I am the worst. I am awful. I don't deserve to live. Some of those things where we get worried if we hear our clients going through those experiences. They're endlessly ruminating. They're always like feeling crushed by past experience. Why did this happen to me? What could I have done? What could I have done differently? Or even just being resigned to that past in a way that feels really crushing. So on one end of this spectrum, we have really not much introspection, not much in terms of like holding negative emotions at all, to the point where it becomes uh, just as negatively impactful as the despair and the depressive end of this spectrum. Because in the middle, we want to be somewhere experiencing sorrow, having a depth of emotion, having a reasonable level of introspection without causing ourselves suffering. We should be able to ask ourselves, could I have done something differently in that situation? Was that my fault? Okay, no, that wasn't my fault. Or, yeah, I did play into that a little bit, and feel that emotion that comes with loss, that comes with change in life or transitions, but also feel that emotion in a way that can be expressed and acknowledged, but not necessarily stuck to us and coming along for every journey moving forward. That middle portion here, we're wanting to make sure we're experiencing the emotions, we're feeling them, and that we're able to get through them and let them go and process them and function with them. The mania spectrum is boring versus bipolar. So this is asking, how much creativity do we have as a person? So, because when we think about mania, again, actually, as we covered, we may think of mania as mild, moderate, severe, and that's great for the purpose of diagnoses. Again, these primary spectrums are asking us to think outside of the box in terms of the human experience, and I think that can give us a lot of insight to clients. Maybe even in this case, maybe you're working with someone who doesn't experience mania, but what if they're all the way on the low side of this spectrum? On the left side of this spectrum, we have people who are low energy. They may be described or perceived as like boring or flat, and they have a lack of the French term of joie de vivre, which is a joy of life. People who maybe they're not depressed, but there's just a lack of enjoyment. They don't get much out of things. Just really, yeah. I mean, as the image says, stuck in the mud. And on the far right end, when we're experiencing mania, I think many of us know the hallmarks of mania, but we've got an overabundance of energy. We cannot stop. We're flooded with ideas, and they're an impulsive speech, impulsive action, an inability to act on some of the ideas, some of the things that come with mania. And then in the middle, we fluctuate between less energy and spontaneity and more. Most of us experience some level of bipolarity in our affect, but it remains within a sustainable window. So you might have days, weeks where you have more energy, where you're more outgoing, where you're going to the farmer's market and you go to the bookstore and you meet up with friends after work and things like that. And then you might have a month where it's kind of more low key. Maybe you go home after work and just spend time by yourself or with your significant other, with your family. But it's just not as high energy as the previous several weeks were. The difference, though, is that bipolarity that most of us experience remains in a sustainable window, and it allows us to experience the beauty of life and live life fully. Due to those differing states, you get different things during those high energy states than you do in the lower energy states, and you might get beneficial things or beneficial experiences from both. The anxiety spectrum. This one is, how much vigilance do you have? This one seems like, to me, one of the ones where, like, conceptually it seemed a little bit more obvious, for lack of a better term. And so on this far left side, I mean, just careless, reckless, this person could be in danger because anxiety is vital to our survival. If somebody is really, really, really far on this side of the spectrum of vigilance, are they putting themselves in dangerous situations? Um, are they experiencing, or are they displaying thrill-seeking behaviors in a way that is truly dangerous to themselves? On the right side, overly fearful, too cautious. And this is to the point where we're experiencing, or this person would be experiencing, panic attacks and possibly like anxiety related physical health illnesses, lowered immune system, ulcers, maybe things like that from worry and anxiety. And then in the middle section here, I loved the way that Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz put this. They put it as, we want to be comfortable with driving with the top down, because if we think about it, driving with the top down, there's risk there. We don't know what might fly off the back of a semi, or a bird might come by and try to come in your car or something like that. And yet driving with the top down is something that's considered usual, pretty normal in our society, right? And so someone in the middle of this spectrum is measuring risks of a situation, measuring the reality of a situation, and living in that sweet spot of their life. Because we can talk about something might come off the back of a semi, or something, a bird might try to swoop in while your top is down. But realistically, the chances of those things happening are fairly small, and that allows us to live in this sweet spot of life. The psychosis spectrum, visionless versus psychotic. This one I thought was kind of interesting because it's how strong are your dreams and visions? We don't often think about this in therapy. Again, psychosis, to at least in my opinion, generally is, if someone's experiencing psychosis, that must be severe, and that's it. And Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz are asking us to think about this a little bit differently, in that psychosis is also like a form of our dreams and the visions that we have for ourselves. So somebody on the far left of this spectrum here is, I love how they describe it, boring, uninspired guy. This person has no dreams for their life, no vision for moving forward. They have a hard time envisioning their future. They may struggle to find enjoyment in life due to the lack of vision. It can be really hard to enjoy the present if we don't know where we want to end up, or if we don't have dreams or visions. On the far right, psychosis generally as we know it, this person is flooded. They struggle to differentiate between reality and fantasy, likely are hallucinating. And at that end of the spectrum, it's a severe psychiatric diagnosis, and generally not something that we are going to address on the outpatient level. This is going to require some like inpatient, at least to help to like stabilize, get med management underway. It's going to be something in the inpatient realm. And then in the middle, and I love that they allude to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. here. They have him as inspiring and vision filled, a little bit past the 50% mark here. And I think that's a really good way of describing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in that middle area, we're full of inspiration. We're full of hope. We may still experience moments closer to boring, or even moments closer to the psychotic side. But we're able to have transformative experiences in our life based on our level of vision and the dreams that we have for ourselves. We're able to change our life to help ourselves move forward toward whatever it is we want to achieve. The focusing spectrum. This one, again, I think is one that's fairly easy to conceptualize for all of us. I just had never thought of putting ADHD and OCD on the same spectrum. So I think this is an interesting take. So on the left side here, on the ADHD side, no focus, the mind wanders, we're distractible. This person on this end of the spectrum may be formally diagnosed with ADHD, or they may not. But generally, we kind of know the symptoms in this field. Again, difficulty focusing, difficulty staying on one topic or on one task, difficulty with organization, those types of things. And then on the far other end, the OCD end of this, the obsessive compulsive end, these folks are dealing with inability to shift focus of attention. They're imprisoned by attention, in the words of Dr. Buser and Cruz. I thought that was really beautiful language in terms of the way that it helped me to understand that. Imprisoned by attention. They're locked into rituals and generally experience significant impairment in work and in their social life because of those experiences. And in the middle, we can maintain focus. We have a flexible focus for the times when we need to maybe bop around between three tasks. We can figure out a way to organize that and put it together. Or if we just have one task, we can stay on it, get it completed, and move forward with it. Again, this one seems like one of these primary spectrums. It's fairly straightforward. The substance abuse spectrum. Ascetic versus addicted. How much pleasure do you seek? Pretty straightforward here as well. On the left side, they use an ascetic monk. It's a lack of motivation or a lack of desire for pleasure. This person may seem incapable of enjoyment and could present this way by choice or their personality style. It could be evidence of maybe like a depressive disorder diagnosis, but it does not necessarily have to be. And so we're just, again, the whole point of going through these primary spectrums is thinking about this in a way that better helps us uh, better helps us conceptualize that spectrum rather than just mild, moderate, severe. It's building on that spectrum that the DSM already provides. On the far right side, on the addiction side of this spectrum, it, entirely motivated by pleasure seeking, rarely denying themselves anything that feels good. Ordinary experiences can be distressing for folks that are dealing with addiction. In my work in addiction, one thing that has come up often, and I say to clients, is for people that have dealt with addiction, the comfortable moments can feel uncomfortable. The moments where people who aren't struggling with addiction feel okay, they feel calm, they feel safe, they feel comfortable. Those dealing with addiction may find that very distressing. And then in the middle, you know, we're wanting to have a balance. We want to let loose every once in a while and have a glass of wine when it's, when it's appropriate, if you have a Friday night free or something like that. But this is something where we're able to put limits on ourselves and restrictions and know if I were to only seek out this pleasure all the time, there are going to be negative outcomes. There are going to be bad things that happen in my life. I'm able to rein myself in. I'm able to pull myself back and say, okay, I had a nice night. I had 3 glasses of wine and sang karaoke. Now it's Saturday and I need to be productive and get some yard work done. Something like that. The autism spectrum, codependent versus autistic. I thought that this one was really interesting too, because these are two topics that come up in therapy often. But again, I had never thought about placing them on the same spectrum. On that left side would be the autism spectrum disorder. So, as a lot of us know, these are going to be people that interactions with others can be disruptive to them. There can be minimally communicative, can struggle with physical touch, can struggle with being overly stimulated, and that leads to a lot of difficulties for the people around them, for their support system. And so it is important to know, to what degree is this impacting this person's life and how can we help them in their support system. But on the opposite end of this spectrum, the codependent end of this spectrum, we're enmeshed with support systems and in our relationships. There's poor boundaries going on, and people on this end are going to have low or no tolerance for being alone. And one thing that Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz noted is this particularly can cause problems in family systems when the children leave the nest. Codependency can thrive in those first 18, 20 years or so. And then there's a pretty abrupt cutoff. So being aware of to what level or to where does my client fall on this spectrum, even if there's not a diagnosis that's applicable, can be really helpful just to know and help our clients to prepare for things changing in life. In the middle section here on this spectrum, we're interdependent. Connectedness is vital. We're responsive to connection, and our connections are meaningful. We have friends. We are close with our family members. We have work relationships that are beneficial in some way, and they don't overwhelm us, and they also don't become the sole focus of our attachment. Finally, the personality spectrum, neurotic versus obnoxious. It's like, to what level do you blame other people versus yourself, basically? On the left side of this spectrum, someone has a neurotic personality. They're blaming themselves too much, and they're shouldering all of the suffering on their own. So not only are they blaming themselves, they're not seeking any support from anyone else in their lives in that blame. everything in their life could be a pitfall that is ultimately their own fault. And that can be really difficult for these clients because we have to help to build up that sense of self, help to build up some boundaries in communication as well, and help to break that pattern of if something is wrong, it must be me. On the far right end of this spectrum, we're working with people who are basically not finding fault in themselves. Narcissistic could be a term you would use here. No fault in themselves. Everything is everyone else's problem. They can evoke very strong emotions in other people because of this attitude. And Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz noted that a lot of times those clients that are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are going to fall towards that end of this spectrum, which makes sense. And then in the middle of this spectrum, finally, we want to be people, and we want to help our clients to become people who accept responsibility without letting a shortcoming become the definition of ourself. We want fluidity and flexibility in the face of our problems. And the trick here, though, the tricky part is most of us do experience the extremes of this spectrum more than maybe we experience the extremes of the other spectrums. And what I mean by that is we usually save the extremes of these spectrums for the people who are closest to us. And if you reflect on your life, are there times where you've maybe fell into that neurotic, everything is my fault mindset in a relationship with family, significant other, children, even something like that? Or do we lean all the way to the opposite end and kind of go on that like blame mode, take the flamethrower out and say everything is all of you guys' fault, I didn't do any of this? And we generally, again, we all experience that from time to time, and it unfortunately tends to be with the people who are closest to us. We've got just a couple slides left. These ones will be kind of quick, but I did want to touch on them. So the secondary areas, according to Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz, they label these secondary areas because these types of disorders do not lend themselves readily to primary spectrums like those 8 that I had just shared with you. They noted that in future versions of the DSM, trauma and stressor related disorders may be able to be better placed onto a spectrum than it is now. But right now, they still consider it a secondary area because of how difficult it can be to place that on a spectrum. So I'm just noting these areas and then changes that have been made. These are pretty quick and most of them are minor. Trauma and stressor related disorders. DSM-5 text revision emphasizes persistent negative alterations in mood and cognition. That is the biggest thing in this set of diagnoses, and DSM-5 text revision has really sought to emphasize that. Adjustment disorder was moved into this category because it is more directly related to trauma or stress. It was previously in mood disorders. Neurodevelopmental and neurocognitive disorders. This was in DSM-5, but reading, mathematics, and written expression disorders were combined into specific learning disorder. And I believe that there are specifiers on that disorder. And then emphasis on diagnosing intellectual development disorder based on adaptive functioning. In the past, it was just IQ work. And in my realm, in outpatient as a therapist, we aren't really working with these types of diagnoses, but I wanted to note them. Dissociative disorders and somatic disorders, DSM-5 text revision, dissociative fugue is now a specifier. And then derealization was added to depersonalization disorder. So now it's derealization / depersonalization disorder. Feeding and eating disorders. This category was added in DSM-5. ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, was added and intended for children's diagnosis, and binge eating disorder has been acknowledged. Sleep disorders, DSM-5 recategorized these to show that there's a spectrum between medical concerns about sleep and psychological concerns about sleep. And then rapid eye movement, sleep behavior disorder and restless leg syndrome were both added, but that was in DSM-5. Gender dysphoria. DSM-5 replaced the term identity disorder with a concept of gender incongruence, which is an awesome change. And then gender dysphoria was moved from sexual dysfunctions and paraphilias to decrease stigma, along with the previously noted language changes. So I think that's just really cool and great for the clients we work with, and our mindsets as therapists. And then sexual dysfunctions and paraphilic disorders. DSM-5, vaginismus and dyspareunia were removed, but they were replaced with genitopelvic pain / penetration disorder. And I feel like that was to be a little bit more encapsulating. And I believe that also was reflective of an ICD change. It is why they went that route. And then sexual aversion disorder was removed because there was not much evidence base. And that brings us about to the end of our journey, folks. Here is the book that I've been referring to. I've also got it in my references here, but DSM-5-TR, Insanely Simplified. Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz are awesome in this book. It's a really good way to just get a primer on what's different that I really need to know and how it impacts my work as a professional. Finally, this link here, the APA DSM-5-TR fact sheet, that's what I referenced earlier. That has links or separate links on the page to every single minute change made within the DSM-5 text revision. I have hit on the majority of them and certainly the major ones. But if you're curious about any, like just what were the other changes, there they all are at this link. We'll have the slides available, so you'll be able to have that link. And then the rest of my references, two pages from the APA, DSM-5's integrated approach to diagnosis and classifications, and then the passage on unspecified mood disorder. Overview of what's new and what's changed is where my notes about the diagnostic criteria changing, and then obviously the book DSM-5-TR Insanely Simplified. Thanks everybody. I hope that this was really useful for you. I hope that this gives you a little bit of a different way to think about these diagnoses and these spectrums, in addition to just getting that education on what's changed between DSM-4, DSM-5, and DSM-5 text revision. Thanks everybody. I hope you all have a good day, and thanks for joining us at CARE4U2. Bye.